Testing, testing. Hello, there we go. Hello, everybody. Hello, Andrew. Testing, okay. Can everyone hear me good? Excellent. Well, I'm Gregor Arturo. I just moved to Boulder here this month, September 11th, 2 hours before it started torrential downpouring. And so that might set the tone a little bit for this talk. I've been a little sleep deprived, dealing with the flood. Things are just starting to calm down right when you guys got here. And well, yeah, I'll start talking about this flood for a second because it's really relevant. And my work involves systems theory. It's seeing the whole system. And here a lot of people are here just for the science. There's so much more than the science. And people are always surprised when they hear me talk about science that I didn't go to school for science. I actually went to school for classics and understanding myth and story and language. And to me, a human being, a character, is the highest evolution of our science. And seeing the patterns within a character. But you can also see the patterns within, say, an energy system, technology. And so when I was a kid, the first piece of science I was exposed to that really caught my attention, my parents got me this pop-up book of natural disasters. And there was floods and forest fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, and it definitely imprinted on me in terms of where I've gone with my career. And so I have this knack of showing up at the right place at the right time, or you could say wrong place at the right time, but got here for this 500-year flood and got to experience it. I showed up in Huntsville, Alabama, day before the worst tornado in U.S. history, if you remember that a couple years ago, and really experiencing the power of Mother Earth. And so one of the things I've done with studying natural disasters is seeing the extreme polarization within a system. And so systems theory is about seeing all the different levels of the system and how it works together. And one of the fundamental things I like to talk about is Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so say with a natural disaster, you're looking at an extreme polarization within a system. And so to get you on this bandwidth of thinking with understanding equal and opposite reaction and how I approach science intuitively is when I first moved to Asheville, North Carolina several years ago. And I moved into my place. I realized there was corner spiders everywhere in my place, and I was a little claustrophobic about it. And so I started cleaning them and getting them out. And my friend Tree came over, and he's like, "What are you doing?" He's just everyone in Asheville just learns to leave the corners to the corner spiders. It's just what you do. And everywhere in Asheville, every single corner, there's a corner spider. And while after living in Asheville for a year, I went to a dome, this professionally made dome, and I noticed in this structure there wasn't a single corner spider. Why is there no corner spiders in this structure? This is the first room in Asheville that I can't find a corner spider. So why is it the corner spiders are going into the corners? And so it came to me intuitively one day that they're going into these corners in terms of feng shui. If you study feng shui, you'll learn how stagnant energy builds up in these corners. And that the corner spiders go up into these corners and build a web to help disperse the energy. And that's just me talking about it very simply without getting more into the science. And so one of the things with how I observe nature is looking for these imbalances. And so the beautiful thing about Asheville, it's in the Pisgah National Forest. And it's the most diverse temperate rainforest on the planet. There is more ecology in 1 acre in Pisgah than anywhere in North America. And so what's interesting about that, when I get back to Newton's third law of motion, because with systems theory, you apply that across the board. You can apply that to human behavior in that there's so much ecological diversity that when humans come in and they disturb this environment, you can readily see how nature creates that equal and opposite reaction. And so the same with, say, a natural disaster like the flood, is where there's this huge imbalance in our environment, you have these, you can almost say like a flood is like a cleansing, like Noah's Ark, coming in and rebalancing the environment. And so where I want to start with is the start. It's the Big Bang, and really understanding a different perspective with the Big Bang. And while I'm sharing all this, is to change our wavelength of thinking, to reapproach our process of perception of reality just a little bit different. Because when we can do that, we can start to understand why a lot of us are here is technology in a completely different way. And that in some things, as a lot of us know, we got our science a little bit backwards in some things. And such as, what really is electricity? What is electricity? What is this electron? And so there's all this jargon with science in our world where we really don't understand what we're dealing with. And so my presentation, we're not going to have any visuals. This is going to be all qualitative discussion and really helping you see what I see and what I'm trying to create. I want to share with you my world right now. And with the Big Bang, the big notion of the Big Bang that we're all told is that in the beginning, that everything was compressed into a single little point, and that was very hot and dense. And so these are key words to think about, is hot and dense. And well, there's polarity, and understanding what polarity is. And so, well, what's the opposite of hot and dense? Well, it's cold and sparse. And so we have a theory based on us coming from polarity. And if you start to understand reality, you understand that reality is all based off polarity. And that, where does polarity come from? It comes from a place of balance, of stability. And so Albert Einstein talked about the ether, and he himself believed in the ether, in saying that if the ether does exist, we can never measure it because it's inert. And really understanding what does something mean when it's inert. And so let's change this perspective of the Big Bang. Let's just say, instead of it coming from a place of polarity, such as hot and dense, what about a place of balance, a place of inertness? And so one of the things, in terms of systems theory, is it a closed system or is it an open system? Well, what if we change this concept to an open system? And it's an open system of infinite inertness, infinite balance, infinite neutrality. Well, when you have that, you can pretty much do anything you want with a system. And so if you have this polarization take place, which I'm going to explain that mechanism in a second, and you have a rapid polarization of the ether, a rapid polarization of the inertness. And I'm not going to say the vacuum of space because it's misleading. And if you have a rapid polarization, what comes out of this inertness? Well, you have the vacuum of space. You have this emptiness. You have this sparseness, this coldness, this extreme expansiveness. Well, what's the other end of the polarity? It's extreme compression. It's extreme density in heat. That's matter. That's what we all like to call particles. And so the changing of this philosophy in science is saying that the vacuum of space cannot exist without matter, and that there's a symbiosis between the two. And maybe we could say that the universe is actually expanding because matter is being self-organized. It's being created. And so one of the things with my work is understanding that process. What is the process of growth? And not only growth, but also decay. So much of our physics and science is based on decay. It's based on entropy. And one of the things you see in decay is it's random. But the thing you see with growth is you see coherence. You see self-organization. And so for the last 5 years, I've worked in a field called Vortex-based mathematics, pioneered by Marco Rodin. There's a few other people here, such as Randy, who are talking about VBM. And the thing I like to call VBM, to sum it up, is it is the study of the inherent nature of pattern. It's essentially applying music to mathematics and seeing how pattern exists in itself. And so you have fundamental patterns such as the Fibonacci sequence, which gives rise to the golden ratio. You have a doubling sequence and a halving sequence, which you see with cell division. And we can understand these fundamental patterns at the simplest possible level. you can start to extrapolate to greater complexities. And so when you see something, oh, that's extremely complex, well, it's really just a bunch of simplicities put together. And so from understanding science, from a foundation of simplicity, you can extrapolate all the complexities without trial and error, without statistics, with concreteness, with thorough understanding. And so where I've been moving with my work, I really like to follow Occam's razor. The simplest answer is usually the best. And so how I approach technology is, how do I make this as simple as possible? And really, when you get to the word simple as possible, you could say that attributes to perfection. And with understanding that comes geometry, which is space, but there's this other aspect of the universe called time. And how do you understand time? And that's where music comes in. That's where VBM comes in, with understanding phasing and understanding how time and space want to dance with each other. But then again, I'm still using terms such as space and time. Who can really define time? And there's so many ways to elaborate on it. And it comes to this notion of, how do we use language to describe what we're experiencing? And so if we get back to the Big Bang, well, how do you get this rapid polarization? How does it even happen in the first place? And so what's unique about this conference over others I've been to is you have a big focus here with the aspect of consciousness. How does consciousness play into science, and vice versa? And so the foundation with all my work is understanding vibration. What is vibration? And that vibration has characteristics of space and time. And so with the Big Bang, there's a mechanism that takes place. And so in a lot of physics and science, we don't necessarily describe these mechanisms in detail. And that's a process. What is the process underhand? What is the process of you growing up as a human being? Understanding the actual nature of process. And so I've done a lot of traveling, and the thing I've learned with traveling is it's not about the destination. It's not about creating this working prototype. What is the process of creating this? I could just talk about the last few years of what I've gone through with trying to create this technology. So the process is so fundamental in understanding the mechanism of process. And one of these fundamental mechanisms to understand over any mechanism in reality is, what is the mechanism of vibration? How does the universe give rise to vibration? At the moment, for myself, the only way I can thoroughly describe it is metaphysically, is through consciousness. And that takes into systems theory. And so systems theory is looking at, you could say, finite aspects within an infinite system. At least that's how I perceive it. And so if you have, say, a set, and say this set includes all the colors of the spectrum, okay? Light, white light includes all these different spectrums of color. That's your set we're working with, okay? And let's call white light the infinite. It contains everything in existence. We're narrowing this down to color, but all aspects of color. Well, to perceive, say, red in this set, you have to forget blue, yellow, green. You gotta let go of all the colors. And so this is the basis of perception, in that you could say in a God state, you're aware of all the colors, but to really experience what red is, what a red rose smells like, you gotta forget all the other smells. You gotta forget all the other colors. You have to perceive this one thing. And so the actual nature of consciousness within a system, in that you could say this infinite being, if it wants to experience itself, it has to forget itself. It has to forget everything in the system and allow one thing to be perceived. And it is in this notion of perception, and even in the word itself, forget, and that when you forget something, it is forgetting something out of the process. And that we almost like put those two words together. You don't even realize that the word is for and get. And that there is truly something you get out of that process of letting go, and that you can experience. And so what is this fundamental mechanism that, say, an infinite being wants to experience a red rose? It's curiosity. Just simply curiosity. And he's curious enough to experience this one little aspect and forget everything else. And when that happens, you're creating an expansion and compression within a system. And this is a metaphysical way to describe this. But when you have that expansion and compression within a system, it gives rise to a vibration. And so you could say the Big Bang is a fundamental moment of realization. It is a fundamental moment of being curious, of where all of a sudden you could say this God being wanted to perceive one little simple thing. And when that happened, boom, the universe is created. So this is a completely different way to perceive science and seeing how this all interrelates and works together. And so with VBM, which has helped me develop these ideas, there's specific number sequences we use. And these number sequences interact with each other and create more complex forms of number sequences, greater complexities, which are still rooted in simplicity. And with understanding these number sequences abstractly, you can then extrapolate them to vibration, and that they're all different forms of vibration. If you get into vibrational mechanics and physics, you'll learn there's longitudinal waves, there's transverse waves, longitudinal and transverse standing waves, and understanding that there's these different types of expansion and compression of a system. And how do these different forms of vibration interact with each other? And so when we have something like electricity, and we're powering up a device, as one of the speakers here talked about earlier with ROMAG, is we're forcing the electricity. We are literally pushing it through that system. And what happens when you put force aggressively on a system? You get friction, you get resistance. And so that's an incoherence in the system. So how do we create coherence in the system? Which you could say is bring coherence to friction, or even negate friction in the system itself. Okay? When you see this, say with you, as us, with individuals, and you're working with someone, and it's not constructive, you get friction, and the relationship breaks down, and it falls apart. But when you get symbiosis, and just think of like ballroom dancing. Dancing is always the best metaphor of when everything gets into coherence, everything starts flowing together. There is no friction. There's only beauty. There's only creation. And so the system I've been working on is a system of perfection. Because what is nature? Nature is perfection. But you could also say nature is imperfect, and that's what makes it perfect. It's all paradox. And so one of the things I'm also trying to put forth with science is to really understand science is you need to understand paradox. Because that's the fundamental with perception, is that when you add this variable of perception to science, it creates paradox as a fundamental. In that you could say this space right here includes everything, nothing, and something all at the same time. And if you can really start to wrap your mind around that, you can really start to understand how the universe works. And so back to VBM is when you can start to understand how space-time wants to dance with itself. We can actually understand the matrix code of reality. You can replicate it. And that's biomimicry. And so in the last decade, permaculture has really started to take over this country. And it's with the notion of biomimicry. How do we observe something that nature does, and it does it beautifully? And how do we replicate that with our technology? And so that's the process you're seeing that's happening on the Earth plane right now, as we're moving away from this industrial linear machines into organic technology that directly replicates nature itself. And so for the last 5 years, I've been working on understanding this concept. And this is a torus, and the mighty donut. But the thing about this torus is it has texture to it. It has geometry. So many toruses, when people talk about it, it just looks like a flat donut. But the one thing about the universe, with me starting on this very talk, is it likes to expand and contract. It likes to breathe, and understanding that nature of breath. And so in Vedic studies, there's mantra and really understanding how to use breath to open up your being, to get your being flowing with the environment. And so I'm trying to do this with you could say, material science and geometry is a major focus of my work. And the thing with material science is that's microgeometry. And so when I have this little coil right here, this copper, there's the macro geometry. It's an octagram. It's this 8-pointed toroidal coil. But at the same time, the copper has its own specific geometry, and it's cubic. There's a micro and a macro. And so this comes back to Newton's third law of motion, where Newton himself extrapolated that information from alchemy. And that alchemy is rooted in a foundational text called the Emerald Tablet. I highly recommend everyone to read the Emerald Tablet 100 times over, because it's only 15 lines. And in those 15 lines, it details the universe in beautiful perfection, but it's metaphorical. It's very metaphorical. But then one of the most famous lines is the second line, is that of which is below is that from which is above, and that which is from above is that is of which is from below, to perform the miracle of the one thing. And so with material science, it's understanding the geometry of that actual material and how you create a symbiosis with the macro geometry. And then you can start to create higher levels of order when you introduce other aspects into a system, such as a quartz crystal. And so a quartz crystal is the most, silicon is the most common, or silicon dioxide is the most common mineral on this planet. Now I'm also holding steel, iron. Iron is the most common element on this planet. These are the most readily found things in our soil. So what happens when you put them together? Well, this is the infamous Star of David, a hexagram, but you're seeing it in 3D. And all it is two tubes twisted around each other. I made this by hand a year ago in August on a full moon in Asheville, and it's magnetized. But what's different about this magnetization is it's all internal. It's all contained within the steel. We're all familiar with open loop magnets, where you have north and south at one end, and the magnetic field leaks out and turns back around and comes within itself. But if you have a horseshoe magnet, and you say you take it up to like an old TV, we're all familiar with what happens. It distorts the electron gun that's shooting at the screen, and you get discoloration, because the magnetic field is leaking through the TV. But if you take a steel bar and you put it over that horseshoe magnet and you bring it to the TV, you get very little distortion. You only get distortion because of the right angle in that magnet is so intense that there's some leakage around it. Well, when you get a nice curved form and you have a magnetic field contained within it, there's no leakage. It's just flowing within inside itself. But the thing about magnetism is it has dual properties. It's flowing in both directions at once. And so it's understanding that there's a standing wave nature going on with magnetism. And so a standing wave is when you have two vibrations of equal and opposite polarity essentially colliding with each other and creating the illusion that something's stationary, such as this entire room. Everything seems stationary because everything is composed of standing waves. So before I go into more of how this coil system works, I want to rewrite dimensional theory for a second and help understand a foundation of where I understand vibration as, and hopefully will stimulate all of you to thinking about physics a little differently. And so a lot of my work involves understanding the three fundamental dimensions, the first, second, and third. And one of the things I've come through my work with the realization is that every dimension has its own specific waveform. The one that's most familiar to all of us is electromagnetics, is light. And right now, look around this room, and what do you see? Everything you are observing through your eyes is reflections off two-dimensional surfaces. Or if it's going through glass, it's a refraction through a two-dimensional surface. It's a planar phenomenon. And so one of the best things with being a scientific observer is establish what phenomena are you observing? What are the characteristics of that phenomena? And the first one you'll notice with light is that it's planar. It's always a planar phenomena in terms of how it interacts with planar boundary layers. And so, well, what's the interesting thing about light? Well, there's two-dimensional axes, electricity and magnetism, the electric axis and the magnetic axis, and how they oscillate with each other. Well, then there's also sound. And sound is three-dimensional. It's volumetric. And it has three axes of oscillation. And those axes are all out of phase with each other, which relates to Nikola Tesla's famous polyphase system, and how Tesla had this intuitive understanding of the universe, and he put it into his polyphase system, which is now the basis to our electrical generation. The beauty about this coil system is it's taking Tesla's polyphase system, it's simplifying it, and it's perfecting it. It's adding the geometry and the phasing necessary to make the system what you could say holistic. And so, where am I going to go with this? I'm going to stop. Anyone have any questions so far? Because I tend to lose people. None? Okay. So I'm gonna get more into the coil system and explain this coil system, because a lot of people are always intrigued. How do you take something so simplistic and make it into a working device? And so what if I told you right now that the future of our technology could be simply based on this coil with a quartz crystal inside it? It is the simplest unification of cyclical information with linear information. How do you create a symbiosis in a system? And so there's energy all around us. Oh, this is what I was talking about, was waveforms. And that there are these waveforms all around us. And you have volumetric waveforms, you have planar waveforms, and you have linear waveforms. There's this infamous thing called cold electricity or radiant energy that everyone's talking about. But what really is it? And we haven't been able to fully measure it. And there's a reason why we haven't been able to fully measure it. And so my understanding of this phenomena is scalar waves, is these linear longitudinal waveforms. And so back to sound, I'm saying it's a volumetric waveform, it's considered a longitudinal wave. But it's a longitudinal wave with 3 axes. And that basically means is when you have, say if you have a slinky, okay? I should have brought my slinky. It's usually the only thing I need. And you grab one end of the slinky, and you pull it back, and you compress it, and you let it go, and it bounces back and forth. It's a longitudinal waveform. Now, if I took that slinky and went up and down with it and created a wave motion, which is very visual, as a transverse wave motion. That means the information is oscillating perpendicular to the direction of motion, while a longitudinal waveform it's oscillating parallel to the direction of information transfer. And so back to math, we're learning about perpendicular and parallel when we're kids. We're realizing it's such a fundamental thing in regards to information systems. And so when we get into a first dimensional information systems, we're looking at scalar waves. We're looking at longitudinal waveforms moving in a single axis. And so these coils create a scalar wave. And so I've been doing energy work for about 8 years. And so it's nice to have all these scientific tools to verify things. But it's also great that nature built us with a hand chakra and actually know how to utilize it. And so this guy creates a scalar axis in the core. And it comes up to about right here, it starts to dissipate, going in both directions. And understanding how you can utilize that longitudinal waveform. Now, here's a simple geometric construct of motion that's one of the most important things to understand in the universe. What happens when you have 2 linear constructs come and collide together? Now, in the, I think it's the second law of thermodynamics, there is energy cannot be created nor destroyed. And within physics, we have overlapping magnetic fields, and they say they cancel out. They just cancel out. But they're breaking their own law by saying energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Where does that go? That's what I'm asking. Where does that energy go? And it's understanding how you can convert it from one dimensional axis to another. And so when you have 2 linear objects collide head on, where does that energy go? It expands radially outwards. So this is the basis to magnetism. And so if you have a battery and you have a positive charge and a negative charge, and then let's say you're using 2 12-volt batteries. The thing about DC batteries is it goes from positive voltage to 0. So let's say we have a system that has positive 12 volts and negative 12 volts, okay? And you hook a coil to it, a traditional little solenoid coil spiraling around it, and you have positive 12 going in, negative 12 going in. Well, what's at the midpoint of that coil? It's 0 volts. There is no voltage at the center of that coil. That was one of the most important things in all of electrical engineering that's almost never talked about. And so when you make, say, the infamous Rodin coil, and you're winding a wrap in going in and out, and you have these two inputs and outputs coming out of it, well, there's a midpoint somewhere on that coil, usually exactly opposite to where you're winding it, where there's no voltage. And so if you're trying to create this specific field, you want to create symmetry within the voltage and create a specific flow pattern. And so when you connect that circuit, you're releasing voltage. And voltage is best understood as electrostatic pressure. And that electrostatic pressure contains opposing polarities. What happens when those polarities collide? They neutralize. But they neutralize in terms of conversion, like I was saying, converting to a magnetic field. And that magnetic field radiates out perpendicular to that neutral point. And there's a point where you could say this magnetic field that's radiating out, it separates. And when it separates, that's where the observation comes in. Because observation only comes with polarity. It is impossible to observe, to perceive, to experience inertness, neutrality. And you could say you can do it spiritually or through meditation, just being present in the moment. It's an emptiness, but it's a beautiful emptiness of what that inertness really is. It is the moment of separation of that magnetic field where it becomes observable. And that's seen as traditionally, it's expanding out and coming back in through the poles. And we see that as the magnetic field line. But there's two characteristics to that magnetic field line, a north polarity and a south polarity. And it's only when they're separate, not when they're whole in the system. And so the construct I'm putting forth is two linear polarities colliding and creating a radial expansion. And so you're seeing two first-dimensional constructs of opposing vectors. You could say masculine, feminine, yin and yang, giving rise to a radial perspective, a radial construct in the system, which we call electromagnetism. And it allows for planar phenomena to give rise. Well, then there's also a process of how light interacts with itself. I'm not going to go into detail about this, where it then gives rise to sound. But one of the things that we have backwards with dimensional theory is understanding this axial information, understanding how information relates to itself. And so if you have this scalar axis of two longitudinal waves colliding together, it creates perpendicular a plane. So you're going from a line to a plane. Well, that plane is perpendicular to the line. And so traditionally in dimensional theory, you have a single axis. In the second dimension, you add a second axis. Well, then we'd be saying that in light, well, which axis of light is the scalar axis? Is it the electric axis or is it the magnetic axis? And really, it's neither. And it's saying that the scalar axis, a linear axis, is perpendicular to two other axes of information. So you can say if you combine the first dimension and the second dimension together, you actually have three axes of information. You have a central scalar axis, you have an electric axis, and you have a magnetic axis. And so you almost have what you look like the third dimension in the second dimension. So what's the third dimension? Well, the third dimension, you have to take three axes, which is that same shape of an octahedral axis, the three axes coming together, which is also perpendicular to the other two dimensions. So in the third dimension, you actually have 6 axes of information. And then anybody know the geometry that's created with 6 axes of information? Buckminster Fuller's famous cube octahedron, the vector equilibrium. That's probably the only thing I wish I did have an image to show you, and I recommend to go look it up and study if you're not familiar with it, but it's the cube octahedron. And it contains 6 axes of information. And there's one reason I was in Asheville, North Carolina, is because Buckminster Fuller did his work there, and he's considered one of the founders of systems theory and understanding how a system works with itself. And so when you start to rewrite how a system works, it's how a system communicates with itself, you can then replicate it with biomimicry. And so the beautiful thing about quartz crystal is it's piezoelectric. And so I have a big background in material science, and since I was a little kid, I've had a rock collection. Love rocks and crystals my whole life. So geology, material science has always been a big part. And understanding, why is the whole metaphysical movement so associated with a quartz crystal? What's so unique about a quartz crystal? Well, one of the interesting things in material science is this has a world of properties. This exhibits so many interesting pieces of phenomena. And when it comes to, say, the system I'm working on, it's including every single effect and phenomena quartz exhibits in this system. Same with this coil, with this steel and this geometry. And you take all the different properties of this coil and this crystal, you can create a symbiosis. And that symbiosis is, if you laid out like all the different properties, it's all a big web. It's all connected. It's all cyclical. And a lot of our systems are linear. We put gasoline in our engines, and then it explodes and then it releases it out the back. That's a linear system. What happens if you make that system cyclical? And you use that cyclical system to self-organize energy. And so when I talked about releasing voltage into a coil, it converts to magnetism. Well, what happens if you release that longitudinal wave that's going down the copper wire and you don't have them collide? What happens if you don't create that magnetic field? This is what Tesla figured out, is how do you create what's called an electrostatic shock wave. And so when we come back to vibrational mechanics and wave phenomena, the most interesting of all wave phenomena is a shock wave. Because a shock wave is the most polarized aspect in a system. So when I'm saying I was studying the corner spiders, which is an invasive species in Asheville, in natural disasters, there are extreme polarizations in a system. So what's that extreme polarization? In physics, that's a shock wave. And understanding what a shock wave is. One of the most exhilarating moments in my life is and I've done this quite a bit because I do fire dancing, is snapping a whip. And when that whip snaps at the end, and you break that sound wave, it's just like nothing else. Of feeling that polarization in the space where you can be a mile away and you can hear me snap that whip as it breaks the sound barrier. Well, I was just talking about how sound is third dimensional. How do we create shock waves in the other dimensions? How do we create a shock wave in the first dimension? Because one of the important things with working with scalar waves is it's the densest of all the information within a system. Because as soon as you have two-dimensional axes, you're splitting up that information into two components. It's less sparse. Sound, it's even less sparse. There's a reason that light can travel farther than sound, while scalar waves can travel even farther than light. And it comes back to even the idea of what I'm saying, equal and opposite reaction, is when we get into dimensional theory, and get in the zeroth dimension is infinite density. Where if you go to the other spectrum of dimensions, which I honestly don't have a limit at for myself, it's extreme sparseness. And you could say it's infinite axes of information. And the information is divided up so it's unbelievably sparse. So what's great about using scalar waves is the density of information that you can move through that system. And so within a quartz crystal, getting back to the piezoelectric aspect, the piezoelectric aspect converts electrostatic charge to sound and vice versa. And so as soon as I touch this crystal, okay, I create a little electrostatic polarization on it. If I squeeze on it, I create electrostatic polarization. And that my body can create mechanical pressure, and it can create electrostatic influences. Because our body is composed of all the same stuff. And the beautiful thing is, it responds to its environment. And so if there's a positive charge here, that means the crystal is going to become negatively charged here. And the opposing side will then become positively charged. Everything's just steps of response to stimuli. Well, when those become positively charged and negatively charged on either end, they attract and it pulls the crystal in and causes perpendicular to the crystal to expand. This creates a mechanical sound wave. Now, crystals were first used in radios back in the early 1900s. And honestly, it's understanding a crystal radio as really the evolution of Tesla's Wardenclyffe system. of how he uses a crystal, a diode, and an antenna to tune into background information, rectify that information, to then observe that information. It's essentially what Tesla did with Wardenclyffe, in that he's tuning to the background radiation of this planet, the Schumann resonance, rectifying it into something we can use. But the bigger concept Tesla used with Wardenclyffe is how do you utilize the pressure you already have? And so when I have a battery, okay, a little 1.5 volt battery, okay, it's a polarized element. There's pressure in that system. As soon as I connect that battery, I start to lose my pressure. I start to lose my electrostatic pressure in that system. But what if I can use that pressure to self-organize more pressure? And so the biggest example in nature is a hurricane. And a hurricane consists of multiple polarities, such as hot air, cold air, dense air, expansive air, clockwise rotation, counterclockwise rotation. It has all these opposing polarities to create a symbiosis in a system. And what does this pressure do? This system of pressure? It self-organizes more pressure. A hurricane will keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger as long as there's hot, cool air rising off the ocean, that humid air. As long as it's there, a hurricane will continue to grow, and it's unstoppable. What stops a hurricane? Usually when it hits land, when it loses that fuel source. And so the thing with the free energy movement is it's really not free. It's coming from somewhere. What is it we're tapping into? But the thing is, there are so many different things to tap into in the background field. One of the things I'm most interested in is thermal mass, is the actual kinetic motion of an atom. And so one of the things we have a disassociation with temperature is that it's actually a vibration. There's an actual waveform associated with it. In physics, we call it phonons. And understanding how the crystal lattice structure of a material, and the lattice structure relates to three-dimensional constructs, sound, how it radiates phonons. And these phonons are the acoustic equivalent of a photon. But as we all know, in engineering, there's a phrase called heat loss, inefficiencies in the system. And in transformers in electrical engineering, there's things called eddy currents. And these eddy currents are also considered losses in the system. But what happens if you bring coherence to the eddy currents, bring coherence to the friction and heat in the system? Well, you can start to do some very interesting things. And so if you have a material at a specific temperature that's a differential between the temperature around it, it's going to emit phonons because there's an instability. But those phonons are incoherent. They're just scattered all over the place. And so it just feels like it's radiating heat. But that heat that we're experiencing, it has geometry. It has phasing associated with it. And when you bring coherence to it, you can tap into it. And so one of the things you'll hear with over-unity devices is that the number one indicator that your systems is experiencing over-unity, besides demonstrating it with a load of some sort, is it's cooling. What is causing this cooling phenomena? And so one of the things that Tesla was doing with Wardenclyffe is utilizing a spark gap, and how a spark gap exhibits negative resistance. And so in electrical engineering, there's resistance, inductance, and voltage, and which relates to capacitance. And so these three things, resistance, capacitance, and inductance, we all study in electrical engineering in the positive forms, but there's negative aspects of the system. Negative resistance, negative inductance, and negative capacitance. And what exactly are these phenomena? And as if you study traditional literature, there's very, very little on those three phenomena. And it's almost never discussed. But negative resistance allows for a self-organization of voltage. This is what Tesla discovered with the spark gap. And it's been since improved with other designs, such as with Eric Dollard using plasma tubes. And so what essentially Tesla's doing with this gigantic tower is he's bringing it into resonance with the Earth, between the ionosphere and the ground. I could talk about that whole system for an hour in itself. But once he brings that system into resonance, every time I talk to an electrical engineer about this, and you want to pull energy from that system, well, you're just going to bring it out of resonance. There's not that much energy in the system. But if you can create a massive polarization with this tower and not pull any energy from the tower itself, but you use the tower to self-organize even more pressure, all the energy you self-organize, you can utilize this. And this relates to, say, the golden ratio of the Fibonacci sequence, in that 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, taking a piece and adding it to the next piece. It's essentially what I was describing with dimensional theory. Instead of it being linear, going one dimension on the next, you're adding each dimension on top of each other. And I just lost what I was talking about. Yes.
The easier way to explain that for people would understand it. You're pushing a child in a swing. And every time the child comes back, they go a little higher, and you add the same amount of energy again.
Absolutely. And so it's applying that concept of a hurricane to a Tesla tower systems. How do I self-organize more energy? And so when I'm talking about the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence, is if this system maintains 5 units of energy, that 5 units of energy could be utilized to self-organize 3 more units of energy, which means you have 3 units of energy at your disposal to put into, say, a load. But as soon as you utilize 4 units of energy, you're taking away from your foundation, and you're not able to maintain that self-organizational process. And so with these systems, it's to get a system in resonance to thus self-organize more energy within the system. So the 2 projects I've been working on in the last 4 years is creating a Wardenclyffe tower. Once again, I had a 27-foot tower in Asheville, North Carolina. It was stolen by a Manhattan man and partially destroyed and never saw the light of day. Oh yeah, that's exactly what happened. And working on this coil system. And the coil system is something that will self-organize energy. And they can take that organized energy, which is really a massive electrostatic polarization, and you put it into the right geometry and phasing, you can use it to distort space-time. Or you could say to create your own gravitational field. If you have a device creating a gravitational differential where you could say there's denser gravity in front of you and less gravity behind you, you're going to potentially fall toward where there's less gravity. And that's understanding electrostatics. With the Tesla tower system, how that system is utilized is once you have a tower and it's oscillating with the ionosphere, if that system is set up to utilize that electrostatic polarization, to self-organize more polarization, you can then utilize that to power, say, a house. Well, the beautiful thing about these towers is as soon as you have more than one, and if they're laid out in the right ways geometrically, which is understanding ley lines, and dowsers would be really useful for this, that's getting the towers placed at specific nodes of a wavelength, of a vibration on the planet, and tuning these towers together. And so you could say it's more effective to have 3 small towers in geometrical alignment than 1 large tower, and understanding how they symbiotically work together. And you can even then have, say, say here in Boulder, we could build 3 very large towers in the area, which becomes the foundation for the power here in town. But then every house could have its own small little tower, which tunes in to the big towers. And this isn't using electromagnetism, this is using electrostatics, scalar waves as the basics for powering. And so it comes into even beautiful concepts. Have you ever seen Tesla holding the light bulb in his hand, lighting it up, or in the Tesla movie that was made, I think, in the late 70s, that they showed him sticking them in the ground and lighting them up. They're only going to light up, though, if he places them in a specific spot. So this is where it really starts to reinvent dowsing and becomes a major aspect to contracting and construction, where you want to have all these lights on your pathway into your house. Well, the dowser would be like, oh, here's a node, here's a node, here's a node. It's every 2 feet, there's a node, place a light there, light there, light there. And it's going to tune in to the field you're strengthening. Because that field, that vibration, it's always present on the planet. But every time we cut down a tree, or we let one of the ancient monuments degrade to where it's not in resonance with the environment, that field gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And what's happening right now? The magnetic field is decreasing. It's accelerating its decrease in strength every day right now. Well, in my opinion, one of the major reasons is deforestation. It's understanding how a tree...
There's more trees in America today than there was when the Pilgrims got here, sir.
Really?
Yes.
That's right. How do you know that? How do you know that?
It's a fact. I mean, we
Where's
cut
the
down
where
trees
can you reference to that?
Yeah.
We cut down trees for firewood in the 17th, 18th, and a lot of the 19th century of all the backwoods people. Prior to around 1950, America became electrified, and basically at that point, people went to kerosene and diesel heating. Up until then, they burned trees, and wood was the #1 thing. Coal was used for heating in the United States, and thanks to our wonderful foresting people, we have bigger and better forests today than we've ever had. And I was raised in Washington State in a logging area. One of the things that ticks me off is when I hear some tree hugger saying, "Oh, this clear cutting, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard of." Actually, it's the smartest thing you can do in the forest, because the way you fight a forest fire is with fire. And if you got a forest fire in this 20 square miles, you set 4 to 4 corners on it and let it burn together and burn out. And if anybody here's ever been near a forest fire, it'll set this tent on fire from a mile away. Mm-hmm. That's how much heat there is from a forest fire.
Well, so, yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is I started out this talk talking about natural disasters. I could go on a while about how forest fires are a natural process and that we've been hindering that natural process. But what you're saying, I don't doubt what you're saying, but something that is very true, that's a huge, huge difference between the forest now and forest 500 years ago. We have almost no old growth. There is so little old growth on this planet. And when I'm talking about me being a healer, and I can experience the scalar wave coming out of this is just my own perception. I'm not going to back this up scientifically. There is a big, big difference between a 1,000-year-old tree and a 50-year-old tree when you experience it. I can't talk to a 50-year-old tree. I can talk to a 1,000-year-old tree. There's something that happens with a tree when it sits on this planet for so unbelievably long, and what happens to its consciousness. That is drastically missing on this planet. I've seen very few extremely large old growth trees on this planet, and it's really sad every time we lose one. So when I'm talking making a Tesla tower, I'm talking about biomimicry. I'm talking about replicating those old growth trees and putting them into a system on this planet. And there's many things that's causing the magnetic field to degrade. That's my honest opinion, is the lack of old growth. I'd say for the deforestation, but it's the lack of old growth on this planet. And so I'm not just focus now, I think, on the coil system and wrap this up, because this has been my life's work, is understanding the simplicity of this system. There's so many people that have not been able to understand what I'm going at here with the simplicity of how does this coil, this piece of metal, and this crystal work together in symbiosis. Am I saying this system works right now? No. I'm saying it definitely does not, because it's not in tune. It's like I made a rudimentary violin and rudimentary bowstring, but it's not in tune. You know, it's not a work of art. And so engineering is coming to the point, especially with 3D printing, where I can get that coil printed immaculately, perfectly the way I want. But then you also come into, well, what's the difference between this coil that I made by hand, I had to fabricate a machine to build this, and say a 3D printed one? Well, a big difference is when this machine twists this wire together, it twists the lattice structure. And I can't get that twist in 3D printing. And so it really comes to how do I fabricate this system where every aspect of this system has coherence, that the system dances with itself. And so the idea is this guy is always emitting phonons, like I was saying, but they're always incoherent. So the concept is, how do I create an environment, a room, to bring coherence to this crystal? And this comes back to in the very beginning when I'm talking about feng shui, is how do we create rooms to create coherence of space? And when that happens, you can get, say, a clear audio signal. And so there's more than, say, quartz crystal works with this coil, where this coil works with diamond. And what's really interesting about diamond is diamond has the highest acoustic frequency of any known material. Now I'm talking about phonon frequency. It's around 50 megahertz because it has the shortest wavelength of any known carbon, of any known element, and specifically in diamond because it's so dense. Well, what's really interesting about diamond is the best thermal conductor in nature. And so what happens if I can tune to this pure frequency of carbon, this pure 50 megahertz frequency, and I start to pull the thermal mass, that energy from the diamond, it starts cooling. Well, because it's the best thermal conductor, it's going to heat up really fast if the environment around it has a differential, if it's hotter. And so that's the idea of these systems, is using crystals to bring coherence to the crystal structure, to where you can then bring coherence to the phonons, to where you basically, when I'm saying incoherence and coherence with vibrations, in coherence, you'll have wave nodes all over the place. We have coherence, node, 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 node. You know exactly where these nodes are. You can, in that way, you can create, you can streamline the resonance. This is, so with understanding electrical engineering, this is with a resonant transformer, and how you line up these nodes to allow effective transfer from, say, a primary coil to a secondary coil with almost no loss of energy in the system. This is what Tesla figured out, how to do this with an air coil without having steel or a magnetic substrate in the center of it. And so the main idea with this system is how this coil essentially is a room or a container for this crystal that brings coherence to this system. And the beautiful thing about steel is it's ferromagnetic. And when it's stimulated by a magnetic field, it creates an acoustic wave. And when a quartz crystal is stimulated by a sound, it creates the electrostatic charge, which in turn creates the electromagnetic wave. But you've got a cyclical system of exchange between sound and light, going back and forth within the system. And so when you can create an initial stimulus in this system, which relates to thermoluminescence, and that's another talk, initially stimulate this system and it puts into resonance, is it takes that thermal mass, which is sound, and it starts converting it into light. It starts creating a polarized coil. But the thing that's different about this coil, as you start to turn it on, you don't lose energy in the system because there's no friction, there's no resistance, there's only coherence. And so the system starts to build resonance. And it basically, as soon as you have that crystal in tune and you put it in that coil, it turns on right there and then. And it starts to, but I'm saying right then, it doesn't immediately turn on, it starts to build and build and build to where it can't build anymore. And then that system is fully polarized. So what I create when that system's fully polarized, it's a hurricane. And it's a hurricane to the point where it can't grow anymore. Well, then what happens if I take another hurricane and put it next to another hurricane? You can see this in nature. So what happens when you have a hurricane from the northern hemisphere collide with the southern hemisphere? It's a very rare phenomenon, but they dance. They start to spiral around each other, just like the yin-yang. And so when you can start to extrapolate that simplicity of concept of those two components and take those components and put them into a larger system, such as, say, one coil structure of one geometry to another coil structure of another geometry, you can start to create these elaborate systems that not only self-organize energy, but they create a massive polarization of the ether. It allows you to create your own gravitational field. And so essentially what I've been presenting with all of this is how do we create a system that reflects nature perfectly to fuel our dreams. And my dream is to travel, is to constantly, perpetually travel all I want, everywhere, all the time. And it's with this technology that life will be easier, and not only easier, it will be more joyful. And that we'll be able to experience what we really want to experience. With some people it might be the stars, and some people it might be able to just go from LA to New York City in 10 minutes. But otherwise, that's the end of my talk at the moment. Does anyone have any questions while we wrap this up? You have the microphone?
Just ask it. We're almost out of time.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Have you researched the work of Walter Russell?
I have researched the work of Walter Russell quite a bit. So,
Can you apply that with
well, I mean, I'm talking metaphysics, and it's using some of Russell's language. Russell talks a lot about equal and opposite reactions, but I researched Russell, Schauberger, Dollard, all the big names I'm extremely familiar with. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Oh, if anyone would like to experience the coils, then I'll leave them right here for the moment. Absolutely.